Look, I believe in free speech, but I had you there for a second, didn't I? Of course I believe in free speech, but does the rest of society really believe in free speech? We have things like the Global Disinformation Index, and governments around the world seem to be falling all over themselves to introduce new legislation to try to put a lid on the internet. Is this the right way to go? My guest this week has been a victim of anti-disinformation campaigns, and we talk about how to protect freedom in the age of the internet.
I'm Freddie Sayers. I'm editor-in-chief at UnHerd, which is an online publication based out of the UK, devoted to independent thinking and making sure we avoid the herd mentality.
You came across something called the Global Disinformation Index at UnHerd almost by accident. By way of introduction to exactly what that is, can you tell me a little bit of the story of exactly what happened?
Right. So we started taking advertisements on our website just last year. We've actually been going for more than 5 years, but we're a subscription site. We have a number of other revenue streams, and we've never really had online ads. We thought we should add that to our business model. We approached a number of ad agencies or kind of ad partners, and each time we did so, we had the same experience, which is the ad agencies were super excited about it. We have a large audience. The content is very high quality. It's mainly opinion and comment and analysis, but from really famous names from both sides of the Atlantic, very carefully edited, fact-checked, all of that. And it has a broad and very influential audience. So they were like, great, let's go for this. And they would give us estimates of what they thought it could make on a monthly basis. And then each time we started it, and only a tiny fraction of that revenue would come through. There were almost no ads appearing. And even the ad agencies, the people we had partnered with, couldn't understand it. They were like, I don't know what's going on here. So we would try someone else, but have the same experience. Eventually, on the third go, we worked out what was going on, which is that inside the really complex ecosystem of online adverts, there are various things like buying platforms, programmatic ad delivery. It's so complicated that often even the people in the business don't quite understand who gets which ads. But in that complex system, there are these entities called ratings agencies. And what they have offered is essentially a service where they will go around different news websites and media outlets and give them a rating, a bit like a kind of credit rating score that you might get with a bank, on how likely to produce disinformation a particular website is. Based on those scores, the ad sort of selling and buying platforms will either send them the normal amount of ads or they will get turned off. And what had happened to us was that although on some of these ratings agencies we scored super high, there's a famous one called NewsGuard, which is kind of the biggest in this business. I now know, having looked into it, we were given 92.5 out of 100, which is 5 points more than the New York Times. On another one called the Global Disinformation Index, we were not only given the bottom score, but we were put on what they call their dynamic exclusion list, which is basically the naughty list. It's the blacklist. It's the list you don't want to be on of the most dangerous websites on the internet. And because these entities have such reach and such power, all of the various ad buying platforms were using GDI, Global Disinformation Index, data. And as a result, we were effectively blocked. So we weren't receiving any ad revenue.
My name's Claire Melford. I'm the co-founder and executive director of a not-for-profit founded here in the UK but operating around the world called the Global Disinformation Index. We are working on trying to defund disinformation. Defund disinformation.
He's now published a document that he says he obtained from Coots that explains why they closed his bank account.
As of today, a bank or other financial service provider will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order.
And then a few minutes later, the bombshell, the Free Speech Union's PayPal account was being shut down. No notification, no notice at all. I'd been charged, tried, found guilty and convicted.
The GDI was set up as a not-for-profit explicitly to try and break the automatic link between highly clickable content and ad dollars when that content is highly disinforming, hateful, polarizing content. Polarizing content.
I mean, of course, we were kind of outraged by this, surprised, didn't understand what we could have possibly done wrong. We eventually got through to this organization, and through quite a complicated series, I think it was 4 relationships in, we eventually got an answer. And I can actually read a little bit of what they said to us. This is a quote. "Our team re-reviewed the domain. The rating will not change as it continues to have anti-LGBTQI plus narratives. The site authors have been called out for being anti-trans. Kathleen Stock is acknowledged as a prominent gender-critical feminist." So what you have there is kind of a surprising reason for including someone on a disinformation danger list, which is that we publish, among other people, a number of prominent, quote-unquote, gender-critical feminists. Gender-critical meaning people who believe there are biological sexes, they differ, and that difference matters. Hardly disinformation, you might think. And Kathleen Stock, as it happens, is a very brilliant columnist. She's a well-known philosophy professor, published in also the Sunday Times and all over the place. And one of her, I think, most important achievements is over the past few years having highlighted the dangers of some of this gender ideology, some of the questions around transitioning medically children and minors before they're certain about gender dysphoria, all of those things which in this country, in the UK, have actually concluded with the Cass review, which was a government sort of piece of research, which is leading to big changes in government policy, and that a lot more care is now going to be exercised before letting children go on a so-called gender transition journey. So to my mind, her journalism and what she contributed to that debate is exactly what good journalism should do, which is where there's a consensus and where those people who are trying to protect that consensus view are demonizing anyone who questions it. There are still voices outside the mainstream who persevere and make the case with care and caution and due attention to facts. And that's exactly what Kathleen Stock did. So ironically, the very thing that we are most proud of, and we think is kind of the best example of what journalism should do, was being cited by this mysterious organization as disinformation. So since that original exchange, we found out a few more crucial details to do with the GDI. Firstly, and I think most shockingly, this organization has received government money, not just from the British government, totaling £2.6 million over a 4-year period, but the American government via the State Department, the European Union government, and the German Foreign Office. So it is a global government-funded organization. Second of all, when you look into their history, they have gone through what I would call a carefully intellectualized mission creep, where their original sort of reason for existence in 2018 was to combat disinformation defined as false information deliberately spread to deceive. Now, with a narrow, sensible definition like that, I guess you could make the case that it is useful to have entities going around the internet trying to call out the most egregious examples of people just making stuff up. Personally, I think you're probably going to come into some difficulties even with that project, but at least you can see the logic for it. Over the years, they have changed their definition of disinformation to something which the founder, Claire Melford, calls a more useful definition. And that is something called adversarial narratives. So this means that even if a piece of content is factually accurate and contains no factual errors, if it fits into what they and their algorithms identify as an adversarial narrative, which they define as something that attacks either a protected group, a particular individual, or the science, that would then be flagged as disinformation. So that was the grounds on which they were flagging our site and content like Kathleen Stock's columns. And, you know, as a project, it strikes me as just so shocking, so counter to anyone's idea of how a free press should operate, that relatively clandestine, very unaccountable organizations hidden deep in the complex bureaucracy of ad delivery networks should basically be turning on and off the business models of publication based on pretty much things they don't like. Self-defined versions of words like disinformation, algorithms they themselves write. And if our experience is anything to go by, it can make a difference of more than 90% to the amount of ad revenue they get. So we think it's kind of important to highlight the existence of these entities and just how much mission creep there has been.
Speaking of mission creep, what makes a lot of this so scary is the way that notions of harm tend to extend and expand over time. In a widely cited paper entitled Concept Creep, Psychology's Expanded Concepts of Harm and Pathology by Nick Haslam, published in the journal Psychological Inquiry in 2016, the author refers to and gives name to a phenomenon long described by sociologists in relation to a number of different phenomena, including a variety of social problems and their harms and the people affected by them, psychiatric categories, and other forms of psychologization and psychiatrization. In short, they expand. He describes how this concept creep, or semantic inflation, often takes horizontal and vertical forms. They are horizontal when concepts extend outward to capture qualitatively new phenomena, and they extend vertically to capture less extreme phenomena. Haslam points to a number of examples: abuse, bullying, trauma, mental disorder, addiction, prejudice. All of these have undergone this kind of semantic inflation. They have extended to include more and more phenomena under their umbrella, and they have grown to capture less severe phenomena. It's a widespread phenomenon, and Haslam goes through a number of potential drivers, including intellectual forces at work within psychology and cultural trends within society at large. He writes, "Psychology has played a role in the liberal agenda of sensitivity to harm and responsiveness to the harmed, and the growth of the field and its increased focus on negative phenomena, social and personal harm such as abuse, addiction, bullying, mental disorder, prejudice, and trauma, has been symptomatic of the success of that social agenda. I would add to this that when people advocate for awareness and policy change on the basis of a particular harm, it's in their interest to inflate the harm to affect as many people as possible, to be as harmful as possible, because they're not the only ones competing for a space on the political agenda. Not all claimed harms can get the attention that advocates think they deserve, and so they compete with each other for the scarce resource of public attention. Among a huge array of other potential causes, this is an important driver of concept creep. But why does any of this matter? Well, take the example of PTSD. This is a phenomenon that was initially described in relation to some of the worst experiences humans arguably could ever go through. When you hear about PTSD, often that's the image that you have in your mind. But what the person might be describing, particularly when it comes to statistics describing the extent of the problem, might include a huge range of qualitatively less severe phenomena. But at the end of the day, you get a really big estimate. And you're invited to think, wow, that many people are affected by this very severe thing, when that might not be the case. But for our purposes, this tendency for harm to expand has severe consequences when it comes to draconian legislation being drafted in a number of different countries. Canada's Online Harms Bill, C-63, for example, introduced in 2024, is just one chilling example. As The Spectator describes, the stated intent of the bill is something every decent person supports, protecting children from online victimization. Yet behind this noble aim lurks the thought police. This is no exaggeration. This legislation authorizes house arrest and electronic tagging for a person considered likely to commit a future crime. It's right there in the text. If a judge believes there are reasonable grounds to fear a future hate crime, the as of yet innocent party can be sentenced to house arrest, complete with electronic tagging, mandatory drug testing, and communication bans. Failure to cooperate nets you an additional year in jail. If that's not establishing a thought police, I don't know what is. What is a hate crime? According to the bill, it is a communication expressing detestation or vilification. But, clarified the government, this is not the same as disdain or dislike, or speech that discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offends. Now, leaving The Spectator for a moment, defenders of the bill tell us not to worry. It's only going to pertain to the most harmful forms of speech. But remember, concepts of harm have a tendency to expand. Back to The Spectator. Unfortunately, the government didn't think to include a graduated scheme setting out the relative acceptability of the words offend, hurt, humiliate, discredit, dislike, disdain, detest, and vilify. Under Bill C-63, you can be put away for life for a crime whose legal existence hangs on the distinction between dislike and detest.
And the reaction since our investigation has been huge. We had editorials in the Times of London, the main editorial saying that it was dangerous and the work of the GDI should be called into question. We had a formal inquiry within the British government where cabinet ministers were writing to each other, trying to find out what was going on. And eventually there was a formal response from David Cameron, Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, saying that they have ceased funding the GDI and there are no plans to fund them any further. And he underlined no plans in that letter and thanked Kemi Badenoch, the cabinet minister who had brought it to his attention. And even Elon Musk has picked up on our investigation and has called for the GDI to be shut down. But I think what's the kind of sting in the tail here is that even though we've highlighted the existence of these kinds of organizations, and there seems to be near universal agreement that this is overreach, that this shouldn't count as disinformation, and this is a pretty solid example of how the anti-disinformation movement can go wrong. Despite all of that, first of all, the organization themselves hasn't said anything. They have not addressed our case. They've kept completely silent. And I guess their strategy is hunker down, say nothing, wait for it all to blow over and carry on. So we're still on the blacklist. The fundamentals of the case have not changed. They are still doing their work. And here's the irony, even within big companies where the head, the boss, is dead set against this kind of anti-free speech, quite frightening mechanism, further down the food chain, the GDI still has its tentacles. So there's Elon Musk on Twitter. I've had a direct correspondence with him. He's been tweeting saying that the GDI should be shut down and its miscreants who have set it up should be held to account. Turns out that Twitter, even under his ownership, is still actually using GDI data for so-called brand safety via a partnership they have set up with another one of these companies called Integral Ad Sciences. And Oracle, another huge technology company, again, headed up, or at least larger shareholder, founding president Larry Ellison, has been quite vocal about these things. He's, as it happens, a Republican donor. But further down the food chain, even though they had announced that they were going to separate from the GDI, they were not going to engage with them anymore. They announced that last year. Turns out through our investigations that they are still using GDI data. So I've done the best I can here, which is highlight this stuff. We've really put a spotlight on it, and yet we still haven't managed to root it out. These entities are so hidden that I'm kind of struggling as to what to do next. So that's where we've got to so far in this story.
Yeah, and it's terrifying because it operates on so many different levels. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but in Canada, where I'm from, we have a bill that's being forwarded called the Online Harms Bill. And if you look at the way that people are framing it and defending it, it's the typical thing. There's always these talking heads that they get who will they're trying to be critical. And what do they say? It doesn't go far enough. It should have happened much sooner. And you think, something that that's proposing a life sentence for advocating genocide online doesn't go far enough is absolutely ludicrous. But if you look at the way that they frame it, they talk about it like it's this worldwide, it's no big deal. Most industrialized countries have these kinds of controls in place. We're just falling in line with these other countries. But then if you look at these other countries, it's often through these power and control are exerted through these very opaque mechanisms. And it just feels like this, whenever that happens, that there's something going on underneath the surface. There's some kind of global advocacy or lobbying going on. And it's so clandestine. You just feel like it's a game of whack-a-mole. You identify one thing, and then there's something else going on. People will say on YouTube, am I being shadow banned? This sort of thing. So one of the things that I've seen you mention in other podcasts is that when you look at these companies, what they actually say about what they're doing is they think they're doing something good. They think that they are rooting out, radicalism and polarization. It's even framed as protecting democracy. People are saying, well, it's not enough. It's not enough to target, misinformation and adversarial narratives. We also need to target the algorithms. So we have to get the good messages to the people too. Yeah, we have to make sure that the right information is getting to people. This is some scary stuff. But you said what's going to happen is the opposite. It will polarize and radicalize people even more. They're doing this because they think that they're protecting democracy, but why will it radicalize people?
I think to put this whole movement into context, we need to zoom out a bit and think a little bit more historically, because it's all about the post-2016 world, I think.
Yeah.
That is the key year when everything changed. And actually, if you look up on Google Trends, which is quite a handy tool for seeing how much people are searching for something, which is quite a decent proxy for how talked about it is at any given time, you see that the word disinformation prior to 2016 wasn't even a thing. I mean, clearly it's not a new word and it existed in academic circles, but it wasn't in the media dialogue. People weren't looking it up. It was a sort of strange technical term. During 2016, searches increased 4 times, culminating, of course, in the election of Donald Trump. There was that huge scare around disinformation and fake news. There was a huge Russiagate, whether you call it or conspiracy or inquiry, that went on for years. And that really changed the tone. And if you follow the Google Trends data, it goes up to a peak in 2022, which is 30 times higher than in 2016. So this is a new concept. And we've got to ask why. What is it about the world since 2016 that has made people so obsessed with disinformation? Is it just that the internet has grown and is a freer place and that it's possible for bad actors to put around fake news? I don't think so. Clearly, the internet is a free place and it is possible to put bad information out there. But I think to understand it, the politics have to come into frame. And what happened in 2016, of course, were these huge challenges to the status quo, to the established way of seeing things. First with the Brexit referendum, then with the election of Donald Trump. And I believe that if you want to call them the establishment, it's hard to find a decent word for the sort of powers that be prior to 2016, but let's call them the establishment. They had 2 choices. Either they were going to react to those votes and those shocks to the system with deep introspection, self-criticism, and a realization that the world they were building was not perfect, and that large chunks of their fellow citizens, in some cases more than half, were deeply unhappy with it, and that they needed to change. That would have been the correct response, in my view. I wish that had been the way they went. That didn't happen. Instead, as we all know, there was this huge amount of defensiveness and terror, and a movement to demonize those people who thought differently, whether you call them populists or however you want to describe them. And the disinformation movement, I think, is very much part of that spirit. It's an attempt to move controversial political questions out of the realm of politics and free debate and free expression and the marketplace of ideas, and into a sort of technical realm where only experts or particular people with particular credentials can decide if things are officially allowed or officially not allowed, officially extremist or not, true or not. And it was a sort of defense mechanism, a way to say, okay, well, we're going to create this new...
In part 2, we go in depth on the debate between free speech versus control and discuss why, if existing laws and protections already cover a lot of what new proposed laws are supposed to defend against, why the need for these new laws? Visit www.patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley.